Welcome, I'm Professor Monahan, and this is our first lecture of Western Civilization 1. Perhaps you've heard the term Western civilization bandied about, perhaps you haven't. And so today I want to do, in this short lecture, do two things. One, talk about this concept of Western civilization and what we think we're doing when we're teaching the history of it. And two, bring to your attention ways in which this is a problematic concept. And problematic as it is, nonetheless, there are lots of things worth learning in our course, and so we will proceed with learning them to become more educated people, educated, critically addressing the things that we encounter, but gaining knowledge as we go. And so after kind of having this discussion about Western civilization and why it's problematic, I want to talk about the origins of a civilization. So Western civilization as a college course began being taught not in Europe, but in America around the time of World War I. And why it began being taught in World War I, according to one historian, Alderus, writing in the 1980s, was that in part, the reason derived from a need to help unify Americans around its European allies in the fighting of World War I. Meanwhile, discrete countries of Europe hadn't been teaching Western Civ. They'd been teaching their own particular national histories. But America, which linked itself through its heritage of immigrants coming from all over the world, but initially mostly from Europe in what was those original colonies, America really linked itself to those traditions of Western Europe, that heritage of Western Europe. And so while there wasn't much chance that college students would take discrete histories of every European nation for their gen ed requirements, there just wasn't room in the curriculum. And so Western civilization courses emerged as one course to condense and teach what was understood and thought to be essential and valuable about Western history and culture. The United States had reasons beyond World War I to link itself to that long civilizational heritage. So loosely put, when we talk about Western civilization, we're talking about a sort of Western legacy. We're talking about a culture united around ideas, a culture that has certain defining features. And what do these defining features include? Well, when we talk about Western civilization, we include the rule of law. Do the ends justify the means? Like, can you just do anything if you can get away with it, if you're tough enough? Or is there a sense of law, of rights and norms that are protected? Our Constitution is based entirely in a sense of due process, that everyone is subject to some sort of law. It contains this idea, our legal system contains this idea that an individual is innocent until proven guilty. That concept, that legal concept, emerges from the time of Justinian in ancient Rome. We'll study that. Western Civ today also, loosely put, when we talk about the West, we're invoking an idea of democracy, or if not democracy, which is, even the United States of America doesn't have a pure democracy, but rather a representational government, a Republican form of government. We'll talk about what these terms mean. But that idea of participatory government, that in order to be legitimate, a state must have buy-in from, if not all, some portion of the society, some portion of the culture. That participatory government is a foundation of Western civilization. Also, when we talk about Western civilization, we invoke things like civil rights, freedom, liberty, that people deserve and should be free, that a government should be constrained against imposing on those freedoms without just legally defined cause. Now, one thing to know, also, when we talk about Western values for a long time, we've talked about the separation of church and state. And that is linked to this idea that people should have freedom of conscience. Whether you wanted to be a Congregationalist or a Baptist, it was your right to do so, was one of the founding ideals of our founding fathers. They were students of the wars of religion that ripped apart Europe in the wake of the Reformation, which we'll study in this course. And so that study of history made them that much more committed to this idea of freedom of conscience, and that the government shouldn't be a theocracy being a state where the religion of the state is the religion of all the people, and that you are defying the state to have a different religion. Freedom of conscience is a fundamental Western ideal, we might say, and what that looks like is separation of church and state. Western ideals also see themselves as, another Western idea is reason. And that reason leads us to the scientific method, and that we have a method through which we can arrive at truth, agreeable truth, and that we also make progress. So this is a list of ideas and values that are associated with Western civilization. All well and good? Sure, right? And it's a very triumphant, and I put some book titles up here: The Triumph of the West, How the West Won, The Right Side of History, How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. There has been much ink spilled on a triumphalist view of Western civilization. Now, let's talk about problems with that concept. First of all, let me just say that just about this whole list of happy things that I've put down, none of those happen in our course. This is Western Civilization 1. We are going to end our course in the midst of the wars of religion, where many governments still claim to be autocracies. They are ruled by kings or queens that are not subject to any sort of constitutional constraints or constraints of a representative body. Rather, they are appointed by God, and what they say is the law. So no democracy, not the same sort of rule of law in the way we think about it. Although the Hammurabi Law Code, which is to kind of counter the own discussion I'm having with you, the Hammurabi Law Code, which is one of the first written law codes, it articulates that the powerful should not oppress the weak. It also articulates different tiers of society. There's a free personer, there's a free person, there's commoners, there's slaves, and no one has, for the bulk of our course, has any notion of equal rights and civil rights, that women and men should be treated the same, that a peasant is entitled to the same types of things as the king or a noble. So that idea of equal rights, we don't find it in our course. Similarly, we don't see the idea of separation of church and state. And in large part, one of the many firestorms unleashed by the Reformation is this idea, is a breaking down of this idea that the king's ruler is going to be the rule. The king's religion is the religion for everyone. We will, in our course, start to talk about the scientific method, the scientific revolution as a historical episode that does open the doors to rational thought and progress, technological and other types of progress. So all of those ideals are coming, and they appear more in Western 2 courses than in Western Civ 1, Western Civ 2 than in Western Civ 1. But at the end of our course, this kind of pat list of what makes the West so great isn't going to be fully formed by a long shot. There's another problem. When we talk about the West, when we talk about the West, we mean in large part this geography. Western Europe and the United States has linked itself to that tradition as well. And this map shows us the modern Middle East, or the not West. Well, immediately you'll recognize that many of the places in the modern Middle East, that is, places that are technologically advanced and not part of the West, are actually west of parts of Europe that are farther east than part of the Middle East. So, and at the same time, we also find that cultures like Mayan and Incan culture, which developed really massive civilizations that left architectural traces, have no part, for the most part, in these histories of Western civilization. So geographically, you already start to see how Western civilization as a concept doesn't just track with geography, and that's a little bit problematic, but puzzling facts, but maybe we can get over that. That's not all. Recall our very good and positive list of things about. Here's another problem. In defining that list of reason and attention to rights and participatory government as being things of the West, we implicitly suggest that places not in the West don't have those things. And as I also mentioned, separation of church and state and scientific method and commitment to progress for the majority of the history that we'll be talking in this course, those aren't priorities. So the way we slot things, both in chronological time and relative to other civilizations, that's problematic too. And then the final thing that you probably don't need me to bring to your attention is that in that very nice, happy list of things that are part of the package of Western civilization and Western culture, we nowhere saw things like imperialism, racism, violence, militarization. It was an entirely triumphalist list, and even if I simplified that list for you in that column on the right, in that slide you saw those books on the left, those are recent books. And this is and so this whole subject of Western civilization, what it entails and how we should teach it in college has been tremendously controversial. And in 1987, this slide shows you some pictures. In 1987, Jesse Jackson and some students led a protest at Stanford University against teaching Western civilization in this form of Eurocentric, celebrating a canon of white male authors, and really arguing that the course as it was taught is problematic and that it should probably incorporate other aspects of civilization. For example, and some of our content is going to do that in large part, and is if you will, no-brainer correction. When we study the Middle East, we'll see how so much knowledge is coming, pardon me, when we study the Middle Ages, you'll see how so much knowledge is coming from the Arab world, which again, doesn't get counted as part of the triumphalist history of Western civilization. And Western civilization is so often associated with Christianity. Well, in our course, we're going to talk about the Islamic world and the contributions it made, and the intense mixing that's going on into the early modern era in the Mediterranean world, which is still a real kind of nest of civilizational progress at the time. When we study the Crusades and the Inquisition and the witchcraft trials, you'll be hard pressed to see the rationale for talking about rational, fair systems of authority and government, perhaps. Now, so we've talked about Western Civ as a cultural package of triumphant ideas and why that's problematic. And now I just want to move on. Oh, and I can show you. I have this little slide. If you didn't believe me that it was problematic, I just have these few things pulled off the internet, and you can see that on the right side of the political spectrum, there is felt this need to defend Western civilization and the teaching of it. And on the left side of the political spectrum, but not only on the left side, as this slide right here shows you, the left-wing Western civilization requirement makes it, this article that you can see linked to here, makes a case from a more left perspective on why it's important, worthwhile to teach Western Civ. But you can, these clips and capture some of the controversy associated with this course. And even here is a cartoon from the late 19th century, putting this notion of the white man's burden. And we see an Englishman and Uncle Sam carrying colored people as they are a burden, being helped and rescued by white powerful men. Onward. So as problematic as the conceptual ways in which we have historically packaged this course are, nonetheless, there's much to learn here. And with that, so with that mission in mind, we'll press forward, addressing these concepts critically as we go along the way, but also learning about the history of human civilization and some of the things it has entailed. And the first thing to know, perhaps, is that 90% of human history is prehistory. And on the course website, you'll see the link to watch a TED Talk by David Christian talking about big history. So I'd like you to watch that and just be aware that 90% of human history is prehistory. Human history begins for us, well, human civilization begins with the Neolithic Revolution in some ways, and it depends a bit on that definition of civilization. So when we date history, we'll say the Paleolithic age was about a little over 200,000 years ago. And we see hominids that used tools and have left them behind in African soil, and much, much longer than that. And also Homo sapiens, which was almost us. The oldest skeletal remains of Homo sapiens has been found, almost us, not quite human beings. And those remains date to about 160,000 years ago. About 50,000 years ago, there are remains of Homo sapiens sapiens. That's us. And that these people begin moving, they're found in Africa, and they move from Africa into Asia. The theories of how this happened are debated, and the paleosciences are moving even as we speak. So I'll kind of refrain from giving you the last word on that history of humanity, because as a historian, I mostly work I work with things human beings leave behind intentionally. And that, whether that means things they write down or a painting or a building they built, those are the types of sources that I, as historian, use. So for all these ages, we have the Stone Age gets characterized as the Paleolithic age, and then the Mesolithic age, where people are making more slightly more complex tools, where they actually domesticate dogs in the Mesolithic age. Since I'm a dog lover, I love that. And then we have the Neolithic, or the New Stone Age, and that is characterized by the Neolithic Revolution, a revolution that takes place over thousands of years, actually. But the Neolithic Revolution consists of two major developments. And those two major developments are that people domesticate animals and they start to rely on agriculture to feed themselves on a regular basis. Now, agriculture, there's different ways to do it. There's sort of root agriculture and tree agriculture, where human communities, before they would kind of take a plow and till a row and put seeds in it and then cultivate that, they would do things like burn a field so that it was more conducive to grow plants that they could use and eat, or pick trees, or find roots, and sort of cultivate from the edges, if you will. And so that's a sort of a seed root type of, tree root type of agriculture. And then a bit more advanced comes this seed and crop agriculture, where human communities, they are plowing fields, they are irrigating, they are bringing water into those fields, and tending it. Now, this kind of agriculture can be vastly more productive, but it also can be riskier. An entire field can be wiped out by a hailstone or a storm or a late season frost. And so this kind of agriculture, while the payoffs can be really big, the risks are great as well. And so you want to have a lot of, and they require much more labor, concentrated labor. And so that's one way agriculture is changing. Also, the domestication of animals. The domestication of animals, and it means that people can now stay in one spot, be more sedentary. They can build buildings, build irrigation systems so that they can irrigate those crops that give them a more stable calorie source. And herds themselves can provide a stable source that you're not hunter-gatherers were quite accomplished, but probably experienced hunger in seasonal ways, as many early agricultural societies did as well. But that those stable domestic herds that you tend and cultivate and cull could also provide sources of calories. So the Neolithic revolution is a game changer, because now people have more control over their calories. They don't need to move as they've moved before. So they start building communities and cities. And this leads to, as many historians put it, the origins of civilization. So what is civilization? Civilization is counted in one definition as a human community or society that has produced a state, a political entity that transcends the loyalties and bonds of family and kinship, that it goes beyond the close-knit kinship bonds of a small hunter-gatherer clan into a broader society. And characteristics of pre-modern civilizations include cities with large buildings and buildings for community purposes. It seems like as soon as we have civilization, we see people coming together in rituals, in religious rituals. We see political systems. It's more than just a family We see the emergence of production of textiles, pottery, or crafts for local uses and trade. So making tools gets more advanced as you are producing agriculture and starting to store things. You need big containers to make different types of food, as opposed to just having a fire and eating meat or roots, but pots to store grain and seed. And also textiles become more developed and more advanced. Writing emerges, and writing emerges around 3500 BCE. So that's about 5,500 years ago from our time. And also, I should point out, referring back to the problematic aspects of Western civilization as a concept, writing emerges in Mesopotamia, which is the land. Mesopotamia means land between two rivers, what is now the Middle East. Writing is one of the most proud accomplishments of human civilization, and it's important to point out that this too comes from a place that we now count as not really being part of Western civilization. Civilizations have ceremonies, they have a sense of identity. We start to see more clearly delineated hierarchies in civilization that follows a division of labor. Hunter-gatherer societies, one thing that we're told about them is that they tended to be more egalitarian than the types of civilizations that we will see emerge, where there are nobles and special religious sects and slaves and kings and pharaohs. Again, this pre-modern world is this world of pre-modern civilization is not a world where there's an expectation that everyone deserves the same or has the same rights and privileges, which is a mainstay of one of the ideas we like to think, in theory, of modern Western civilization. After all, the United States is a country founded on the ideal of liberty and justice for all. And that for all meant in opposition to liberty and justice for certain people higher up the hierarchy and not others. And now for the rest of this slide, I can just show you quite quickly. This is our some prehistoric artifacts. One of the earliest, the Venus figurine, one of the earliest pieces of art, perhaps for a ritual or religious reason. And then the cave art at Lascaux in France that was probably drawn about 15,000 BCE. So this is prior to, late Paleolithic, prior to the Neolithic Revolution, in some ways problematizing that idea that it is, that civilization brings the emergence of crafts. Someone made this figurine that had some sort of ritual purpose anyway. Everything that we'll say in this course will be delivered with such a level of generalization that we can bring up exceptions and problematize it. And in some ways, these two images do that for you. This slide is making this point of kind of, when we talk about the Stone Age, these three subperiods, Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic, more than talking about years on the calendar, these are definitions that signal developmental definitions more than chronological ones. If the Neolithic Revolution has two components to it, the development of agriculture and the domestication of animals, one thing we understand now with a clarity that's increased over my lifetime is that it didn't occur in one place and then spread to other places. Various places on the globe developed these ways of being independently of each other. And there's a slide that you'll see on the learning system talking about timing of the origins of agriculture. Here is repeating what does a civilization involve? A political state, a diverse economy, cities with large buildings, a sense of local identity, rituals and religion, some knowledge of writing. The Incas complicate that last facet a bit. People have argued and thought about, why do civilizations form? Is it human nature to aggregate together? Is it for ceremonial reasons? And there is some evidence that some of the earliest gathering places of human civilization, they didn't live together regularly, but they came together whether seasonal, some sort of calendar way. They came together perhaps for religious type rituals. Or was it commerce, that people trade and exchange things and come together? So all of these theories exist. But one thing that seems to be clear is that there are civilization, where there is civilization, we see redistributive practices. A situation in which the state officials control the production and distribution of goods, and not maybe fully control, but regulate, oversee, direct. And at some level, to my mind, as I've thought about this over the years, it's just another way of saying government. I mean, what is a state after all? But some sort of entity or a system of entities that involves itself in some sort of pooling of resources and redistribution, whether it's to collect taxes to build a road or to collect taxes to field an army. That is, at its most basic definition, what states do. In these earliest civilizations that Western textbooks tend to cover, in the region of Mesopotamia in the Middle East, in the Egyptian civilization in the Nile River Valley, these civilizations grow up first around water. And it seems that even before people organized armies, perhaps, they organized irrigation systems to build canals that would optimize how they could retain the benefits of that seasonal flooding to water the crops that they were beginning to raise. Cities, without fail, grow up along rivers. You'll see on the learning management system, I suggested optional video to watch is one from Crash Course World History, where John Green talks about mountain places far from big rivers being the opposite of civilization, maybe. So have a look at that if you're interested. In early civilizations, we see the importance of religion. Early on, these religions seem to be always polytheistic. That is, there are more than one God. There's no separation of church and state. This idea is far from being a twinkle in anyone's eye. And the importance of writing emerges around 3500 BC in Mesopotamia, and it becomes increasingly prevalent. Here is a map of Mesopotamia to get some geography straight. And here is a picture of a very, very ancient architectural remains of early civilization in Mesopotamia. Here is a map of the Nile River Valley, an Egyptian civilization, which we won't give attention to in this course, is a fascinating civilization that lasted many, 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 many more centuries than our civilization has lasted so far, and left behind, among many other things, the pyramids at Giza and writing systems. These are various writing systems in sort of an attempt to chart their evolution. And I will stop there.